Hello, Assalamu alaikum, good evening. I hope you can see me and that you have joined this live lecture. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Masood Raja. You can call me Dr. Masood Raja, and I primarily teach post-colonial studies, and theories of nationalism happen to be a part of it. So we are trying to set up. Meanwhile, I see one person already has joined us. So if you could just, first of all, I want to make sure that you are on YouTube itself. And how do you get there is, let me share my screen with you. And because you might have gone to my website, but there is so if you can see this screen, okay, that's the video link on my website. But instead of clicking here, if you go here, this should take you to the actual live stream on YouTube. And the reason that's important is because then you can post your comments live and I can see them. Now, I've also posted a link here for Dr. Sahar to join us. And if she's able to work this link, then I can put her on screen and she can kind of also moderate the class. So overall, I'm doing it from home. This is my wife's office at home. She has a beautiful office. But I don't have access to my books. So most of it is going to be from my memory or from my understanding of Anderson and whatever I've been able to glean on the internet of the book. But the whole idea is to start with Benedict Anderson and imagined communities. And then if you have any other questions about nationalism, what others have thought about it, what are your own views about it, you can post them in the comments and I'll be very happy to answer those. Now, meanwhile, could you also let me know that you can hear me and just use the comments to let me know that you're here and that you can hear me. And then we can start, in a minute. So it's 7 o'clock in the morning over here, and it's pretty quiet. We live in the country, so not a lot of traffic or anything else. So, okay, so I'm still waiting for Dr. Sahar to join me. I don't know if her link is working, but Dr. Sahar, all you need to do is click on that link and it would ask you a couple of questions. You don't need to download any software or anything. Just click on that link and I'll see if at my end the link seems to be working, but I'll check it once again. Yeah. So yeah, here it's working. It's taking a bit to load, but it says you're entering a broadcast studio. And as soon as you click on the link and enter the studio, then I can add you here and then you can kind of moderate this. All right, so while we wait for this, I'm going to go ahead and start. Now, Anderson's book, if I remember, okay, so if you can't see the link, Naila, you need to be on the YouTube part of it. And if you go up on the comments, I'm going to post it again. And you should see it in the comments. If you are on my website, you will not see it. But if you followed the instructions that quite a few of you all have already followed, You go to the website, and instead of clicking on the video play button, you click on the link on the top left, and that will take you to the interface on YouTube. And if you do that, then you should be able to see the comment stream that's coming on the right side. Now, if you're on your phone, I don't know if you'll see it, but on a desktop, you will see it. But we can start. So the book came out in 1983, and it was a huge book. Anderson previously was also already a pretty established scholar. He and three of his colleagues were already famous even as graduate students because they had published an article in 1971, but the article was researched in the late 60s in Indonesia and had dispelled all the narratives that the Sukarno regime had built about a certain uprising. And because of that, they were all evicted from Indonesia, and they had to come back to America. So Imagined Communities was the first major text that challenges certain organic concept of nations, which we called organistic nationalism or mechanistic concepts of nationalism like the Leviathan and others, and argues, and it starts with three things that he is arguing. Now, if you've read the book, you will know that at the very beginning of the book, Anderson starts with three things that are specific to nationalism, right? And what are those three things? That nationalism is a recent phenomena. Okay, so cool. So before I go there, I'm going to add Dr. Sahar to the screen.
Yeah, hello, Dr.
So she's here. So yeah, there'll be a bit of playback from your screen, but that's okay. So you can introduce the class and what the students are doing, and then I can put you on the. Then I can take over. So sorry. Yeah.
So I think my class already knows that today we have a class with Dr. Raja, a very eminent scholar of post-colonial studies, teaching at University of North Texas, and we are very lucky to have him here with us. And we have been learning a lot from him, and I hope that today's lecture is going to be amazing as well. I would ask the class to keep on please asking the questions in comments so that Dr. Raja, after his lecture, he could address them as well. So thank you, sir, for giving us your time. We can continue.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Sahar. So it's a pleasure to be here, and also it's always a pleasure to interact with my Pakistani friends and students. So as I was saying, that it was a huge book. And so in the beginning, in the introductory part, he starts with three claims, right? One is that nations, nationalism, nation states are a new phenomenon, but each one of them imagines themselves to be ancient, creates the mythologies of a past. So the idea is that they always have this, what he calls, they imagine themselves in an empty, homogeneous time, a time that the whole nation seem to have shared. And then from there, they move into the serial time in which the nation actually exists. So it's a new phenomena, a recent phenomena, but every nation thinks that it has ancient roots and it existed long ago. I mean, think of Pakistan, right? Came into being in 1947, or a lot of our historians would Pakistan उस दिन बना था जब मोहम्मद बिन कासिम जो 712 में सिंध में दाखिल हुए. ਅਸੀਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਠੀਕ ਹੈ यार. I mean, until 1940s there was no concept of Pakistan. There was a concept of a Muslim exceptional identity upon which my book is based, but no concept of a separate nation state for Muslims of India. 1938 is when Iqbal writes an essay about it and makes a speech about it. But retroactively, as a nation, a lot of us go and think and we want to think of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and the Indus River civilizations as Pakistani civilizations, because it's kind of imagining that we have always existed. That's what he's saying in part one of the one attribute of nations is that it's a recent phenomena, but most nations imagine themselves to be ancient, to have a long history. The second one is that nationalism in the current age is universal. Every person, every human being belongs to one nation or the other and claims that identity. Some of us belong to two, like people like me. Okay, and then the third claim that he makes is that nationalism is an idea for which people are willing to die. People are willing to put their lives on the line. Okay, and famously in his book, he also claims that no one will do that for EU or European Union, but for their nation, they will do that. So these are the three attributes that he talks about in the very beginning. Now, I had already argued against his third claim in my first book, because my idea was that no, there are supranational identities for which people are willing to die. And we've already seen it. My last book was on one of those entities called ISIS. And there is this competition between the pull of the national identity and the return of the large dynastic imaginations of how the world ought to be run. We'll talk about that in a minute. So these are the three things that he talks about, right? And then he goes, is that what are the enabling conditions? What happens in the world for the rise of modern nationalism? And that there too, I kind of slightly disagree with him, but I'll first give you what he says. First of all, the pre-nationalistic idea, the world existed under dynastic rules. These were kings who governed large territories and thought that they had the divine right to rule. Second, all these empires or dynasties had a centralized sacred language, Arabic, Latin, right? Before that, the Greeks, the Romans. So there was a dynastic rule, mostly divinely sanctioned, right? And then they had a centralized language. And the people believed that the origin of humans and the world was at the same time, that the world comes to be and the humans are there. There was no claim of evolution and we joining the world way later. Okay. Now it's these three practices and ideas that die out, that are destroyed, and that gives rise to the modern concept of nations. Now, unlike people like Ernest Gellner, theorists of nationalism, people like even Anthony D. Smith, and quite a few others, I have some lectures on them on my channel, who claim that the origin of nationalism is Europe and it is France and England, right, 17th century, and that's Eric Hobsbawm's work on nationalism. What Anderson is suggesting is that no, the nationalism as we know it, nationalism connected to a nation state, emerges outside Europe, and it emerges in the Western Hemisphere, in America, in Brazil, even in Haiti, right? These are the people who claim their own national identities in opposition to their mother countries. And then it travels back to the metropolitan, where France, England, and others then shape themselves into national governments, but they are still also empires. And then that idea travels to the colonies. That's the cartography that he gives of the rise of modern nationalism. And then, why does he call it the imagined communities? Okay, because what he's trying to suggest is that there is no organic, natural nation, right? Nation is an imagined community. And the example that he uses is that if you're from any country and if you find out that something happened to a a Pakistani somewhere or an American somewhere, you feel a certain kind of affinity, you feel a certain kind of anguish. How do you feel that, even if you might have never met this person, right? And that's where he says that the print capitalism plays a huge role. What does he mean by print capitalism? The rise of printing press, right? It does a few things, right? First of all, the printing press in Europe destroys the dynastic languages, their monopoly, because since it's driven by capitalistic demand, and the printers want to publish things that more and more people should be able to read, so they start publishing in what were called the vernacular languages: German, right, Italian, French, English. So what the printing press does is it creates a reading public. Also, it enables circulation of knowledge, and circulation of knowledge in vernacular languages which were considered regional, and that is when the national languages emerge. English emerges as a language. And then two other genres of writing emerge, right? The first is the broadside, the newspaper, right? And what is peculiar about the newspaper is that they always have a national character, but they may not contain just the national news. On one page, on one broadsheet, on one hand, you'll see a national headline, then something happening elsewhere in the world. And it's that experience of opening that newspaper as a larger community and imagining, immediately knowing where you belong. That is the imagined community. Me doing it in my, over my morning coffee, you doing it in your home. So that is how print capitalism creates this idea, this imagination of a nation. The second is the novel as a genre of writing, right? So I used to remember the page number, I think it's page 32, where he's talking about now an Indonesian writer, right? He gives us two instances, two speeches by two leaders. One of them is not speaking in nationalistic terms. The other one is appropriating the vocabularies of nationalism from Europe and translating them into the local parlance, right? That's how he's saying that nationalism gets appropriated by local leaders. But that what he says is it's in the pages of a novel, when you follow the movements of a main character, that in the process of doing so, you also start becoming a part of that nation, that national landscape that is being presented there, right? And so that's what he means by imagined community. And so the more you read about, the novels about characters set in the setting, what you call your nation, more and more of it you imagine to be a part of, right? So, so these are some of the things, that he's talking about in the book. And I can answer any question about that. Now, Anderson also has other works, right? So one of the other most important works that he does, and I'm forgetting the title of it, it was a book chapter in which he also talks about diaspora nationalism. That how is it that these large diasporic communities in metropolitan cultures, like the Jewish community here, the Hindu community here, even the Muslim community here, they always feel connected to the so-called motherland from where their parents came or they came. And part of it is the metropolitan pressure itself that kind of heightens that identity, maybe some form of longing for the primary culture, but also that most of these people tend to be more chauvinistic and conservative than their counterparts in the actual nations where they came from. And they invest heavily in those kind of nationalistic projects. So that also comes from Benedict Anderson. So overall, nation as an imagined community, gives us, the literary scholars, this tool to take the theories of nationalism and then emphasize the role of imagination and the act of reading itself, and then read the novels from that point of view. Now, I would like to point it out here, and I've done it in some of my published work as well, is that actually Timothy Brennan had also published an essay in Homi Bhabha's collected essays on nation and narration, in which he also talks about the role of imaginative literature in creating national consciousness. I have used his work, and I think his work preceded Anderson's a little bit. But in his view, he's not imagining the role of the print capitalism or the novel or the reading public as Benedict Anderson does. So these are like some of my views on Anderson, and I apologize if they're not clear because I don't have access to my books right now. So most of it, the points I was able to glean from the web, but I usually like to read the text that I'm going to talk about. So let me know what you think. If you have any questions, you can post them. Dr. Sahar, I just took you out of the stream, but if you want to join in, feel free to do that. But if you have any questions, you can post them in the links and I'll be happy to answer those. There are 17 of you here, at least logged in. So that's my brief introduction to Benedict Anderson. And I do seriously recommend. Oh, yeah, and I was then going to also argue that this idea that somehow the sacred languages die out and are replaced by
Dr. Raja, I think my internet is really acting up right now, so I couldn't see your question.
Okay, so no, what I was saying is that if you have any questions, please, you can ask them or the students can ask them. But let me just first explain like where I disagree with it is that first of all, the sacred languages don't die out, especially the Arabic doesn't die out. Actually, in the post colonies, Arabic becomes more and more prominent. If you look at Pakistan, until mid 1970s, the students were required to learn, Persian. We were the lucky ones who studied Persian, which was closer to our culture. And then, of course, the Saudis started giving us money, right? And so and the ulama and everything else. So we started learning Arabic, which no one really learns, right? And it has got no connection to our culture. It's not like we grew up reciting Arabic poetry, right? But there's a resurgence of a sacred language, right? And increasingly more in the Islamic world. So that idea that the vernacular kind of kills the sacred language is unsustainable when we come to Islamic world. Then this idea that the larger dynastic imagination is replaced by a national imagination. I mean, we have a huge constituency of fighters and people who still want to revive the concept of Ummah. Now, that concept of Ummah is also imagined, right? Because it's mostly a Sunni Ummah, right? And then the Iranians have their own area of influence. So these larger concepts, nationalism has not put them to rest. There are material and ideological causes for that, and we can go into it. But I think Anderson simplifies that, and even though he does work on Indonesia, he doesn't really understand the rising currents of large mythologies that people are mobilizing, against the nation itself. There has always been a suspicion of the nation-state concept in Islamic philosophy. I mean, if you've read your Iqbal, that famous verse of his, इन ताज़ा खुदाओं में नया एक वतन है जो पैरहन इसका है वो मिल्लत का कफन है. So this idea that rise of nationalism will destroy, and that millat that they were imagining was was imagined, right? I mean, the Ottoman Empire existed, but it's not like it came and took care of us or anyone else. There was just homage paid to the Ottoman Empire, and it was, you know, a brutal regime in so many ways. Yes, they did establish roads and all, but that's why there were uprisings in the Arab world against the Ottomans, because each region was governed by a pasha and they never developed a hegemony. But we imagine those times as, you know, homogeneous empty space in which, you know, ideal world existed. So I'm going to stop here, and Dr. Sahar, there are two questions too, but if you have any questions, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was also talking to my students about the concept of Ummate Muslima.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I
So
mean,
I feel like that is also right. So the internet is really horrible on my side. I'm very sorry if I'm cutting you off or I'm asking questions at the wrong
no, no,
times.
no. Go ahead, please.
But I was talking to all right. So I was talking to my students about the how this is an imagined community as well, because it doesn't have any spatial roots or any any physical roots, but it's just a concept, and we align ourselves to it.
Oh, yeah.
And
I mean,
would you
we
like to talk
imagine
about
it.
that, Dr. Raja?
Yeah, I mean, think of it this way. We imagine it as this ummah as a historical concept. And even when it existed in empires. So there's your Abbasid Empire. And beyond, you know, 8th century, there was no unified Abbasid Empire. The Safavids had already, you know, driven a wedge out of it, which was Mesopotamia, like parts of Iraq and Iran. They were already the part of the, you know, Shah Ismail Safavids empire. But we imagine it as this whole part of it, probably Darul Islam that we used to call it. At least it had one body of law, one central government with strong regional leaders, right? But the concept of Ummah right now, what is it? Right? I mean, if it's, is it like the European Union? Of course not. I mean, if you want to go to Saudi Arabia, do you think you can just show your passport and go there? No. When you go there, do they treat you as brotherly, sisterly Muslim? No, they look down upon you. They think you are inferior to them. And then so in one way, Iqbal was maybe right that the nation states are the ones that divide this concept of Ummah. But on the other hand, the empire did exist. The Ummah did exist at one point, but the reason it existed was not as an imagined community, but as a geographic location under one centralized rule. But when it but even India, by the time the British come, it wasn't Mughal India anymore. I mean, Bahadur Shah Zafar's rule extended just to the Red Fort and suburbs of Delhi. The Marathas had already conquered up to Peshawar, right? And the people like Ahmad Shah Abdali and others that we talk about who came to save the Mughals and Muslims of India actually plundered Delhi, right? They were coming for loot, right? But in our imagination, we ease out all those tensions and replace them with this romanticized view of once we were great, and yeah, maybe we were militarily great, but to think critically of it now, when we imagine that Ummah, it's a concept that we imagine, right? And that concept is romantic,
Yeah.
and that's absolutely true. It might be imagined on the lines of one empire or the other Muslim empire that existed, but is it sustainable? Can we
Yeah.
run it? And if we do, like, what would be the law? Who would run it? Who would become the caliph? I sure hope it's not the Prince of Saudi Arabia, because then we'll all be in trouble and I'll probably be killed. So, you know, those questions, the technical questions, we don't think about. We just imagine that things are going to just start happening. Okay, so I have a few student questions too. Um, so I'm going to put you off screen so that you can watch it. So this is Saud. Let me bring your question. Let's. bring the first question up. So to become a part of an imagined community is much like subject positions that become part of dominant discourses. Uh, I don't know. I mean, here, I mean, discourse, we are always in a discourse, right? So whether dominant or not, you can live in a nation and be part of a non-dominant discourse. You could be a minority group who feels not part of the nation, right? And that's another discursive position. That's another discursive identity. So the larger discourse, let's say if you are in Pakistan, I'm a Pakistani, that's discursively produced. What does it mean? You decide you must have an other, so you impugn all your failures to powers outside. Maybe that's a discursive framework. But within those larger discourses, there are buried discourses, there are silenced discourses. You know, how do women imagine themselves as Pakistanis? So yes, you know, idea of nation then in one way or the other is also discursively produced. It depends on who has defined it, what texts are we using, what texts are being read, who has the power to pronounce what a nation is. All of these discursive frameworks play a role in our imagining of a nation. Good question, though. So if a Muslim from India dies somewhere outside or in India, being in Hindus will never feel, well, that's a huge generalization, and I disagree with it. Okay. Yes, if you're talking about fundamentalist right-wing Hindus, absolutely not, right? But that's the case for fundamentalist right-wing Muslims too. If you're a Wahhabi militant, you won't care if I'm a Shia and I am dead, right? Or you won't care if I'm a woman and I am dead. So it's a subject position. But if you are a liberal Hindu and you're part of the Congress party, you're part of the educated, or not even educated, the left, right? You absolutely would consider Muslims your fellow citizens. You will probably cry, you will die. So this is a myth that we Pakistanis have created, because we take the worst of other groups and amplify it and generalize it. So I completely disagree with that, and I have reasons for it. And my main reason being that it's just like what you are doing is exactly what the American conservatives and right-wing pundits over here do. They pick up the worst examples of Muslims and then generalize it to all the Muslims, as if all Muslims are terrorists, as if Muslims are not capable of empathy for other than Muslims. So that's exactly the same thing. And I would definitely request you to, stop thinking in these generalized terms and hone your thought to a point where you don't have to scapegoat a whole group of people and generalize them just to feel good. And the other thing is, if you are relying on these generalizations, other people are also making generalizations about you. Those are racist. How do you fight them? You can't have one generalization to argue your own point and then say, don't lump all us Muslims, not all of us are terrorists. That's not how it works. A discourse, a counter discourse always is subtle to specificities of people's situation. Now, had your question been the right-wing fundamentalist Hindus probably will not feel that empathy, I would have agreed with you, right? So remember, these generalizations, they only weaken your argument and make you, look not very convincing. So where does the idea of imagined community stand here? Well, I mean, it's still applicable. I think it's part of your question. So I think I've already answered that. Next question. You talked about what is SAS? Did you mean ISIS? Ummah as a geographical. Yeah, it was. Look, the concept is imagined, that it's a one community of all the Muslims in the world who believes in one religion, practices it according to that. So there is that imagination, and maybe there is fraternity and solidarity. But we also imagine that it existed at a time. There was a geographical empire, right? It had the same body of law. It had a central leadership, right? So both of those systems come combined. But the idea that all Muslims are a brotherhood and a sisterhood is deeply ideological. It comes from religion, right? And so we imagine the Ummah. Now, when you technically look at it, it doesn't exist. And maybe part of it is because of nationalism, and part of it is because regional identities won over the larger dynastic identities or identities of Ummah. Will it ever happen? I don't know. I would love to see a world in which all of us can travel freely from one part of the world to other, because I think in planetary terms, so the planet belongs to every single human being and animal that lives on it. And nationalism to me is kind of drawing lines on the map and then making the world a hard place and controlling people's movement. So I would rather not have nations, but I would rather also not have religious or other empires or ummas. I think one humanity on a planetary scale would work much better. But who am I? No one listens to me anyway. So so Ummah is a divine community. Yes, people imagine it like that. But then what is a divine community? I mean, there is no definition of Ummah in the Quran. There is only the definition that all the Muslims are brothers and sisters, right? And if that is the fraternity that Muslims want, absolutely, then it becomes that kind of divinely ordained or divinely articulated community. But then there is, it's not like we are the ones who came up with it. I mean, think of the Jewish diaspora, okay, 2,000 years of, persecution all over the world, and they still maintain their Jewish identity, their idea of what constitutes being a Jew through rituals, through memory, through readings of the Torah, right, through synagogues. So do you think we Muslims have a strong concept of divinely ordained identity? No one has it stronger than the Jewish people. 7 million of them were killed in Holocaust, and they still retain the idea of a loose, Jewish identity. And then the Christians have it too. What does Catholica means? It means universal. So, but long before we Muslims came along and decided that we were going to be an ummah, the concept of the Catholica existed, the concept of the Jewish larger identity existed, and then, other identities. So, yes, it can be divinely ordained, but there are other divinely ordained supranational identities too. Yes, Saud, I get it, but when you asked your question, you didn't specify it. Okay, so in future, be specific. People get you. People like us who work on the borders of cultures, we cannot afford these generalizations. You guys are lucky you live in Pakistan. In Pakistan, with a 99% homogenous community of religion dominated by mullahs and men, you can get away with saying a lot of stuff. People like us who live in diverse cultures and have to incorporate the feelings and habits and thoughts of diverse groups in our classes, we can't afford to make these generalizations. Not that I would like to. So thank you for clarifying that. Okay, here's another question by Haroon. My question is that is imagined community a result of the sense of resisting against a certain idea, or is it the reason behind the good? I honestly don't know. I mean, for Anderson, the idea of the imagined community and the rise of national identities is predicated upon the fact, the three things that he highlights, whose function is weakened, right? So the dynastic empires die out. The sacred languages are replaced by what used to be called vernacular, right? And the third is, of course, rise of print capitalism. So what he is saying is there is a transition from these larger modes of thinking identity to national identity, right? So in that sense, the idea would be that we transition into national identity. But on the other hand, that doesn't presuppose that we can't think in supranational terms, or we can't build larger than national identities. After all, there is a European Union. It's not just an imagined community. It has a body of law, it has a parliament, it has open borders. So people have retained their national identities, but have also created these supranational entities which actually function. So, okay, Faizan has, in your opinion, what elements that are responsible for hybrid identity of like French Algerians? So, I mean, there are no longer any Pied Noir, they were called the French Algerians, because they all left and they burnt half of the country when they left. But at that time, when the Algeria's case was interesting, because the French never saw it as a colony. The French saw it as part of France. That's why it was so hard and so politically fraught with danger for France to let Algeria go, right? So the French Algerians who lived there, even though they lived in their separate towns, you can read Fanon for that, but they thought of themselves as French, okay? The Algerians had representation in the French parliament, right? So when de Gaulle finally decides to let go of Algeria and Algerians win their freedom, there is a huge constituency in France, right, that is opposed to that. And the reason was that they saw themselves as French as well as Algerians. Now remember, when the settled white settlers, French settlers from Algeria leave Algeria, they pretty much burn everything. Hospitals, schools, the buildings so Algeria was one of the very few nation states that emerges that had to build even the infrastructure. So did they think of themselves as Algerians? I don't know. I mean, they thought of themselves as French. And most Algerian elite also thought of themselves as French, right? But that they also thought of themselves as Arabs, right? So I think on the part of the natives, the identities were more hybrid, especially the elite, because they were Arab, but they were also French. I don't think so that the settlers, the European settlers in Algeria, thought of themselves as Arabs. They probably thought of themselves as Algerians, right? But I think they pretty much thought of themselves as French, but their identities were hybrid. They were living in a culture which was hybrid. Right? So, I mean, think of it, who comes from there? Camus comes from there, right? Derrida comes from there. These are the people who grew up in French Algeria. So Derrida is a French Jew who was raised in Algeria, right? So that, how hybrid can you be in your identity? So is globalization also? And I don't think so. I mean, globalization is a political, economic, and cultural, right? So the economic globalization is reality as we exist in it, right? It has rules, it has laws of trade, it impacts our lives, and it exists. It's tangible, right? Now, cultural globalization, maybe part of it is imagined when we imagine that globally we are all humans, we have come together. So those are the imaginative aspects of it. But I think the imagined community part would be as we draw away from economics and politics and move into the realm of culture, and that's where we imagine a globalized world in which all of us can live with dignity as fellow human beings. But as neoliberal globalization itself, as an economic system with political ramifications, is pretty real, right? And we can think of it differently. That's where imagination comes. But it exists, viscerally, it impacts our lives. Good questions. Okay. but you can, when you use Benedict Anderson, you can, you can argue, um, how to, like, okay, if you're reading a Pakistani novel written by a Pakistani author, what kind of an imagined community would emerge, right? Um, if you are reading a Pakistani novel in English, or if you're reading, Khuda Ki Basti or Nadar Log or Udas Naslein, these are the novels of my own time, and Intizar Hussain or Bano Qudsiya even, then you can see what kind of an imagined Pakistan, what kind of a view of Lahore, let's say, Raja Gid would create, right? When you read the parts of Lahore, that imagined community is what you feel a part of, right? And it also is a part of Pakistan. Okay, so Harun question. I feel like imagined communities like Muslim Ummah and Orthodox Hindu, which is becoming more and more obvious, are a result of hatred towards what they don't believe in. I wouldn't say hate. It's like the idea is to seek, some form of social identity, right? Now, the problem with nationalism has always been that it must seek an other, right? Now, there are nations that have complex national identities which can live with the differences. Now, if you look at the Indian Constitution, the reason they have been so successful was because they were able to cobble together a constitution which accounted for the diversity of India, right? And which didn't let it lapse into a majoritarian regime, right? With very strong states' rights. So if you look at the Hindutva movement or the right-wing Hindu fundamentalists, they want a majoritarian state in which the dictate of the majority is what everyone else has to follow. And that's destroying the beauty of India, right? India is one of the most complex democracies in the world and one of the most successful ones too, right? Let's not forget that. It's very easy to just, impugn everything onto India. It's one of the most successful post-colonial nation states with the most complex culture, right? And they did that through their constitution. And because their leaders knew that they could not build it into, a one religion state, even though, they did implement Hindi and all that, right? So Hindu fundamentalists, what are they retrieving? They are retrieving the concept of Mahabharata that pre-existed the advent of Muslims, right? That's the history they want to mobilize. And that is a supranational Hindu identity. What are they mobilizing it against? Against the nation state itself, right? And when they are doing it, so what it must destroy the consensus of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation state, right? And whether it's of hatred or distrust, I don't know. But the idea is that they are retrieving a certain historical ideal against, as the nation state as it exists, against the constitutional civic state, changing the civic structures to that. So maybe there is some hate involved there too. It's just like, our Taliban brothers and sisters, right? They have this idea of Islam. They have this idea of Islamic identity. The borders do not matter to them. So they feel that they are justified in coercing a whole nation into following their path, right? Because their idea is that, they are right, right? And that's why, and this is slightly off the point, that's why the verse that we usually think is peripheral to the Quran, La ikraha fid din, there is no coercion in religion, is so crucial. And it struck me like about 3 years ago when I was thinking about it, because if there is coercion, if someone puts a gun to your head and tells you to pray and you do that, you have committed shirk because you did it of the fear of that person, right? That's why there is no coercion in religion. every action that we follow should not be of the fear of people. It should be from the fear of God, because if you're doing it because of the fear of people, those people are forcing you to commit the most unforgivable sin, which is shirk. Um, Kurds are an ethnic group native to a mountainous region of Western Asia, which spans, 3 countries, and they imagine themselves as a nation, right? And they have this imagined history. It relies on the history, Islamic history, Salahuddin Ayyubi and all. Um, and then they are divided into 3 nation states, parts of Turkey, parts of Iran, 4 actually, parts of Iraq, and parts of Syria. But yes, as a imagined community that thinks of itself as a nation, they constitute a nation, right? Now the question is, can they move to the next phase and get a territory, right? Because remember what Anderson says is that nations have defined territories, right? And they end and they begin. So they need to have a geographic territory that they can call their own and where they are sovereign, right? They govern themselves. So that's another criteria. So how can they claim themselves as because they have a history, they have an ethnic identity, right? And they also have a history of persecution. You'll have to go outside of Benedict Anderson to imagine their nationalism. You'll have to go to Ernest Renan or people who tell you that what role a historic imagination plays in thinking of yourself. But they have a history, and they have objective differences from people where they live in, and then those objective differences become subjective in politics, right? So they have leaders who want a separate country. They claim to be culturally different from their Arab counterparts, and then they are also ostracized by the Arabs and the Turks and everyone else. That further enhances their idea of a communal identity. So there are a lot of theories of nationalism. So you'll have to figure out which one applies to really understand it. But imagined community in one way or the other will apply. Do you think that concept of imagine must not exist simply? What is your stance upon? I have no stance. I mean, to me, concepts are tools, right? I'm a scholar and a teacher. Concepts are tool. Theory is, as Deleuze famously says, a box of tools. You want to open a text, you use it. You don't use it, you just throw it away and move on. I have never given my allegiance to one single way of thought, one single theorist. Sometimes I'm a Marxist, sometimes I'm a cultural critic, sometimes I use Foucault. So imagined community is a tool. I will use it if it's useful. I have used it when it was useful. When it's not useful, I'll move on to some other theorist. It's good to be peripatetic. It's good to not owe your allegiance to one system, because then you can think on the edge of thought. Because when we become part of one theory, Said would famously call it when affiliative structures become filiative, when they become primordial, when we're like, I can't think that thought because I'm Marxist. No, I'm more eclectic. So yeah, it exists, it's useful. Where it's not useful, you move on to the next theory. Right? Okay, so it's been about 50 minutes. So if you have any other questions, Naila, if you would like to add a question, if you would like to ask a question.
Thank you. It was a wonderful, wonderful lecture. I wanted my students to look back at this one quotation, and I would like you to say something about it if there is. I mean, like if you could elaborate it further, which of course you can. There is one big quote of Anderson here, which has been quoted over and over again, where Anderson says that I propose the following definition for nation. It is imagined political community. So, there is not one thing on which it's made. It's political community, imagine both inherently limited and sovereign. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Raja, how can it be inherently limited and sovereign at
So
both
that,
times, like
yeah.
simultaneously?
So that's a very good question. Uh, so it's imagined, as we talked about, limited because it must have a territory, right? A geographic territory, and within that, it should be sovereign. It should be able to decide its own. So what he's conflating then is the idea of nation and the nation state itself. So. Uh, so it's a political community because it must have a political system, right? So we become nations. That's why when Anderson talks about rise of nationalism, he's talking about the Western Hemisphere, because here, America, Haiti, Brazil, these are the nations that actually are not just fighting that, oh, we are Americans, so we should have a separate nation. They are part of, not the Haitians, but others. They are part of the same ethnic and racial group, but their fight is political. They have a territory, and they imagine themselves as a nation. We are Americans, we are Brazilian. And three, they want to be sovereign in that territory in opposition to the mother state from where they had come. So what he means by that is that to be a fully constituted nation as we imagine it, these are some of the basic criteria that it must meet. Is it must be a political imagination of the nation, thinking of myself as a Pakistani American or whatever, and it must be limited in a sense that it must have a territory which has a border, and the moment you cross it that you're not within the body of your nation. And three, that it should be sovereign, that it should be able to make its own laws. Now, all of these things are debatable because the same Anderson who writes about this also goes on and writes about diasporic nationalism, right? So that means that you can leave your nation and live elsewhere and still be a part of it, right? But then there are other theorists of nation and not nation state and nationalism, who argue that there can be nations within nations, right? But to argue that, then we will have to get away from this definition, because then it can't be they should be sovereign and limited. Then it will be they should have a shared culture. They should have a shared imagination of the future. And if you read, let's say, like Anthony D. Smith, I think, uh, yeah, not Anthony D. Smith. There is another theorist whom I cited in one of my books, who talks about how does the idea of nationalism emerge in certain cases, is that if there are two communities living together under the same system, they always have objective differences, right? And when they have those objective differences, they live with them, right? But when politics enters that, those objective differences are subjectivized. And when those objective differences are subjectivized, that's when political national consciousness emerges. So that was Muslims and Hindus, right? This idea of irreconcilability of Muslims and Hindus was a political concept. It wasn't an organic concept. How do we start thinking that Hindus and Muslims their thoughts were irreconcilable? Because politics entered that. Before that, they lived in the same communities, right? They pretty much respected each other as individuals. Hindus went to their own temple, Muslims went to their own mosque. When it was the time for the prayer, the Hindus never played their music and all. They even do that now for each other, right? But when we came up with what we are ironically call the two nation theory, right? The idea was that idea of two nations needed to be constructed ideologically and politically. It didn't exist organically, right? These communities had lived together. They had died for each other in battles and wars, right? If you read the account of the rebellion in Awadh, right, when Hazrat Mahal rides into battle, most of our generals are Hindu, right? Raja Ram Singh, I think, was one of his generals who was offered right, by the British, that if you give up on the Queen and join us, you can retain all your lands. And his answer to them was that the land belongs to the Queen. She gave it to me. You can take it. But my honor belongs to Hazrat Mahal. I will take exile with her. So these examples are always there, but politics then tells us this thought must be excluded to create an exclusive idea of the nation. So I have another question. You're not. Yeah, I disagree. I mean, where he says that people won't die for anything other than a nation. Like his famous example is who would die for EU, European Union, and we have seen people dying for ideas larger than nation states and nations. And it's not just Muslims who are doing that. There are Christian missionaries who go out in dangerous places and die for a cause. There are people, Marxists famously died for each other. I mean, think of where Che Guevara died, right? Was it in Bolivia? I think that wasn't his country. He was from Argentina. And then similarly, if you look at the current international terroristic groups, all of them are supranational groups. So I don't think so that this idea that nation is the only symbol for which people are willing to die holds, because there are supranational entities for which people die. And I don't think so that should be the standard. I mean, my standard would be that it's a thing or an idea for which people would want to live for. But that's my idea. I'm not Benedict Anderson. I'm just an obscure scholar sitting in Texas. Even my own colleagues don't take me seriously. So don't worry about that. Was Benedict Anderson a Marxist? No. Not a Marxist, mostly culturalist. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because it's 8 o'clock. So we've been going on for 1 hour. But thank you, good questions. And I'm so proud of Dr. Sahar that she is giving you all a good education. So any final words?
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. And I hope everything is so much clear. And you have been so generous, Dr. Raja, to all of us in academia in Pakistan. I think your services they need to be acknowledged all the time, because not everybody is like you, is always available to help and to teach like this. So thank you so much. So for waking up in the morning and joining us. It's not easy waking up in the morning, I know that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been very, very eye-opening discussion today.
Thank you. And also, please keep in mind that this will be available, right? I've kept it unlisted, so you let me know if you would like me to just make it public, and then I can just click on a thing and your students can access it on the YouTube, and it will be available for you. If you need to download it and the YouTube doesn't allow you to download it, just let me know and I'll download it and send it to you. So that's all. Thank you so much for all your good questions, and stay safe and take care of each other. Khuda Hafiz. Goodbye.